Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it.
The Forbidden Trail.
I'm the narrator, part of a group of friends who thrive on adventure. Anna, Mike, Lucas, and Sarah. We're the kind of people who live for exploring new places, and our curiosity often overrides any lingering skepticism about local legends. We arrived at our summer camping spot near a small town in the Appalachian Mountains, a place renowned for its breathtaking but remote trails. The locals had been insistent on one point: the Forbidden Trail was not to be ventured upon. They spoke in hushed tones about its dangers, hinting at supernatural forces and unexplained disappearances. But we were young, confident, and convinced that these warnings were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to keep outsiders at bay. So, despite the locals' warnings, we were eager to prove them wrong. The Forbidden Trail was calling to us, and we decided to hike it the next morning. Our excitement was palpable, overshadowing the few lingering doubts. The following day, we set out early, the sun barely peeking through the dense forest canopy. At first, everything seemed normal. The forest was lush and serene, its beauty a stark contrast to the stories we'd heard. The trees were tall and majestic, their leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. But as we ventured deeper, a subtle shift in the atmosphere caught my attention. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in around us, and a strange silence settled over the trail. It wasn't long before we started noticing odd signs. Unusual symbols were carved into the bark of the trees, intricate designs that seemed almost too deliberate to be random. Anna laughed it off, attributing it to the work of bored locals or misguided graffiti artists. She made a few jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush and every distant snap of a twig made my skin prickle with unease. Despite my discomfort, we pushed forward, determined to dismiss our growing unease as mere nerves. After all, we were adventurers, and a few eerie signs weren't going to deter us from what we had set out to do. As we delved deeper into the trail, the oppressive silence grew heavier. The trees closed in around us, their shadows creating a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into eerie patterns on the forest floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, the once cheerful chatter of our group now replaced by an uneasy quiet. The silence was only occasionally interrupted by the snap of a twig or the distant rustle of leaves, sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The markings on the trees, which had started as simple carvings, became more frequent and intricate. They resembled strange symbols or runes, etched into the bark with an artistry that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Lucas was the first to voice what we were all starting to feel. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder. We all stopped, straining our ears to catch whatever he might have heard, but there was nothing but the wind whispering through the leaves. "I didn't hear anything," Anna said, trying to keep the mood light. "Probably just the wind playing tricks on us." But then Lucas's eyes widened. "No, I swear I saw something. It was just a shadow, but it moved, like, really quickly." We all turned to where Lucas was pointing, but the area was empty, the shadows playing tricks in the dim light. Our earlier jokes about the local legends felt hollow now, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The atmosphere was thickening, the forest seeming to press in on us from all sides. We pressed on, trying to shake off the growing unease, when we stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin off the trail. It was barely visible through the overgrowth, its wooden walls covered in layers of moss and grime. The cabin looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, its sagging roof and broken windows giving it a hauntingly derelict appearance. "Should we check it out?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. Despite our better judgment, we decided to explore the cabin. We pushed open the creaky door, stepping into the gloom. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay. Dust-covered furniture sat in disarray, and old, rotting curtains hung limply at the windows. We didn't spend much time inside. The sense of dread was palpable. A feeling of being watched seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. We left the cabin quickly, trying to laugh off our discomfort, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was an unspoken agreement among us that something was not right. As we continued along the trail, the forest seemed to close in even tighter. It was then that we noticed Sarah was missing. "Sarah," I called out, but there was no response. Panic began to set in as we called her name again and again, our voices echoing through the dense forest. We split up, searching frantically for any sign of her. The trail, which had seemed straightforward at first, now twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. It felt as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, shifting and changing, making it impossible to retrace our steps. Our earlier unease had transformed into full-blown fear. With every turn, the trail seemed to lead us deeper into the forest, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. We knew we had to find Sarah, but the forest was increasingly uncooperative, its labyrinthine paths mocking our desperate search. The longer we searched for Sarah, the more disorienting the trail became. It was as if the forest itself had decided to play a cruel game with us. Paths that we were certain we had walked on now seemed blocked or rerouted, hidden by a veil of dense underbrush that hadn't been there before. The sense of the forest being alive grew stronger with each step, guiding us deeper into its labyrinthine grasp. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and our frustration was mounting. Every corner we turned revealed more strange markings carved into the trees, symbols that seemed to pulsate with a faint, eerie glow in the darkening light. These symbols were unlike anything we had seen before. They looked almost like a twisted form of writing, their edges shifting and shimmering as though they were alive. The whispers from earlier had grown louder, more distinct. They no longer felt like random noises carried by the wind, but seemed to form actual words. The whispers seemed to be calling us, guiding us further into the forest. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with us, its voice a soft, menacing murmur that we could not fully understand but felt in our bones. Our sense of unease deepened when we began to see shadowy figures darting between the trees. At first, they were fleeting glimpses, almost too quick to be sure of, but as we pressed on, they became more distinct. Each time we tried to approach these figures, they would vanish, melting into the shadows like wraiths. It was as if we were being herded deeper into the heart of the forest by an unseen force. With no clear direction and the trail shifting beneath our feet, we made the decision to set up a temporary camp. We found a small clearing that seemed relatively safe and tried to make ourselves comfortable, though the sense of foreboding was inescapable. We huddled together around a small fire, our voices low and strained, hoping that Sarah would find her way back to us. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with a new kind of menace. The whispering voices grew louder, and the shadows seemed to press closer to the edges of our firelight. We tried to stay calm, but the tension was unbearable. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. The oppressive silence of the forest was occasionally broken by these sounds, which only added to our growing sense of dread. We took turns keeping watch, but each of us was plagued by the feeling of being watched. It was as if the forest had taken on a life of its own, its eyes constantly following us, its breath hot and heavy on the back of our necks. Despite our best efforts to stay calm and rational, the fear was palpable, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to be closing in on us, making it harder to think clearly or act decisively. As night descended upon us, the forest seemed to come alive with an eerie, almost malevolent energy. The whispers had grown into distant screams, their source impossible to pinpoint. The ground beneath us trembled intermittently, as if something unseen was moving just beneath the surface. The shadowy figures that we had seen earlier were now more distinct, their forms taking on a menacing clarity that made my blood run cold. The fear in the air was palpable. I was pacing near our campfire when I noticed something new. Another marking, this one etched into the bark of a tree close to where we had set up. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized it. It was the same symbol that had been on Sarah's belongings, the one we had seen earlier but had dismissed as mere coincidence. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. these markings were not random. They seemed to be a part of whatever force was hunting us, a clue to its presence and possibly its intentions. The atmosphere around our camp grew even more oppressive. Our fear began to crack the fragile veneer of our group's solidarity. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded into full-blown paranoia. We started to turn on each other, our shared terror manifesting as accusations and blame. Mike and Lucas were in the midst of a heated argument, their voices raised in anger and fear. Anna, overwhelmed by the stress and the seemingly impossible situation, broke down, tears streaming down her face as she cried about how hopeless our situation seemed. We had gone from being a tight-knit group to a fragmented, fearful mess. The bonds that had held us together were fraying under the pressure of the unknown, and the forest seemed to sense our weakness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the rustling outside our camp became more frequent. Figures moved in the shadows, just out of our line of sight, their forms shifting and merging with the darkness. It was clear now that whatever was in the forest was not just observing us. It was actively pursuing us. The shadows were no longer just fleeting glimpses. They were moving with purpose, edging closer to our camp with each passing minute. The forest was no longer a mere backdrop to our plight. It had become an active participant in our nightmare. We couldn't stay here any longer. The decision was made in a frantic rush, and we packed up as quickly as we could. Every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig, seemed to push us into a heightened state of fear. As we fled into the darkness, the realization that we were being hunted settled heavily on us. We had to move quickly, our minds racing with the hope that we could escape before we became the next victims of whatever sinister force prowled the forest. Our flight through the forest was nothing short of a nightmare. The trail, once a path to adventure, had become a chaotic maze of shifting terrain. It twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, the trees and undergrowth moving as if alive, closing in on us with every step. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in from all sides, making every movement a desperate gamble. The full force of the malevolent entity that had tormented us was now evident. The shadowy figures were no longer just fleeting glimpses. They surrounded us, their forms more solid and threatening than ever. It felt like the very essence of the forest was attacking us, the ground trembling and the whispers crescendoing into a cacophony of eerie voices. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, Anna came to a grim realization. We needed to appease the force to have any hope of escaping. Her bravery, though desperate, was our only option. Anna volunteered to stay behind as a diversion, hoping her sacrifice would buy us the time we needed. The sight of her leaving with the shadowy figures, her cries echoing through the forest, was something I will never forget. Her screams were swallowed by the darkness, leaving us to face the forest's wrath alone. As Anna was taken, the forest seemed to relent slightly. The oppressive atmosphere lifted just enough for us to find a narrow path that had been hidden from us before. We stumbled through the dense foliage, our hearts pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The path seemed to open up, leading us toward a familiar landmark, an old sign indicating the way back to civilization. It was a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. Exhausted and traumatized, we emerged from the forest, the cool night air hitting us like a cold slap. We made our way back to town, our minds reeling from the horrors we had experienced. The local residents' warnings about the forbidden trail now made horrifying sense. The forest had indeed been a place of dark forces, and its curse had left a lasting mark on us. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can still hear the whispers from the forest. They follow me into my dreams, a haunting reminder of what we endured. The shadows in my room sometimes seem to move with a life of their own, as if the forest's malevolent presence has somehow made its way into my everyday life. We survived the forbidden trail, but it's clear that its curse will follow us wherever we go, a constant reminder of the terror that lurks in the darkened woods.
The last camp.
It all started as a casual weekend getaway. Just me and my closest friends Mark, Sarah, Jenny, and Tom. We were all enthusiasts when it came to the outdoors, always eager to escape the noise of the city and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. We weren't the kind of people who believed in ghosts or spirits. To us, the supernatural was just something you talked about around a campfire to add a little excitement to the night. We chose a spot deep in the woods of upstate New York, a place we'd heard about from a local hiker. The forest was dense, remote, the kind of place that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The perfect escape. But there was something else about this forest, a legend that we'd heard in passing. A tale of a vengeful spirit that haunted the area. Supposedly, years ago, a woman had died tragically here, and her spirit lingered, angry and unforgiving. We all laughed it off as nothing more than a story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. When we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. We set up camp near a small clearing, the forest surrounding us like a wall of green and brown. It was quiet, too quiet, but we shrugged it off, attributing it to the remoteness of our location. After all, this was exactly what we'd wanted. A place far away from everything and everyone. That night, as we gathered around the campfire, the mood was light. Mark, ever the joker, started telling stories about the spirit of the forest, each one more ridiculous than the last. Jenny added her own twist to the tale, claiming that the spirit was a witch who could possess animals and turn them against us. Tom chimed in, saying that the spirit only appeared on nights when the wind blew from the north. Sarah, though usually the most serious of us all, couldn't resist joining in, making up a story about how the spirit would leave signs if she was nearby, like mysterious footprints or the sound of whispers in the wind. We all laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from a mix of nervousness and disbelief. Deep down, we knew these stories were just that, stories. But there was something about the way the wind picked up just as Sarah finished her tale that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows around the clearing, but I shook off the feeling, blaming it on the chill in the air. As the fire died down, we each retreated to our tents, the laughter from earlier still echoing in our minds. I remember lying there, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, almost lulling me to sleep. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost lost in the wind. I sat up, straining to hear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks, and forced myself to lie back down. But even as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, the morning sun filtering through the canvas of my tent. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of pine and earth. For a moment, everything seemed normal, almost peaceful. But that peace shattered the moment I stepped outside. "Hey, guys, come look at this." Jenny's voice rang out, a mix of confusion and concern. We all gathered around her, our sleepy minds struggling to comprehend what we were seeing. There, in the soft dirt surrounding our campsite, were tracks strange, elongated prints that didn't match any animal we knew of. They circled our tents in a perfect, deliberate pattern, almost as if something had been watching us while we slept. "What the hell made these?" Sarah muttered, her usual calm demeanor cracking slightly. Tom crouched down, inspecting the tracks closely. "It's not a bear, that's for sure, and it's too big to be a coyote. Maybe it's just some local wildlife we're not familiar with," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they didn't make sense. There was something off about these tracks, something unsettling. Mark, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "It's not just the tracks," he said, his voice low and tense. "I felt it last night. Something was watching us." We all turned to look at him, a mix of skepticism and concern on our faces. Mark wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He was the joker, the one who could laugh off any situation. But now, there was a seriousness in his eyes that made my stomach knot. "You're imagining things," Tom said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Maybe you just had a bad dream." "No," Mark insisted, shaking his head. "I know what I felt. There's something out there in the trees, watching, waiting. The unease that had settled over us grew thicker as the day went on. The forest, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt oppressive, as if the very trees were closing in on us. And then there were the whispers, those faint, almost imperceptible sounds that drifted on the wind, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the day wore on, they grew louder, more distinct, until I could no longer ignore them. "What's that sound?" Sarah asked at one point, her voice trembling. We all froze, listening intently. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, like voices carried on the breeze, speaking in a language none of us could understand. "It's just the wind," I said, though my heart was racing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the wind. There was something more, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As the sun began to set, the tension among us was palpable. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. The strange tracks, the whispers, Mark's growing paranoia, it was all starting to get to us. We huddled around the fire that night, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows around our campsite. "We should keep watch," Tom suggested, breaking the uneasy silence. "Just in case." We all agreed, though none of us said what we were really thinking, that we were no longer sure we were alone out here. We took turns, 2 at a time, sitting by the dying fire while the others tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. And all the while, the whispers continued, growing louder as the night deepened. When it was my turn to keep watch with Sarah, we sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us. The forest was dark, impenetrable, and the feeling that something was out there, watching us, never went away. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Me neither," I admitted, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just darkness and those damn whispers, growing louder, closer. We stayed like that until dawn, too scared to move, too scared to speak, as the night seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't know it yet, but that night would be the last time any of us felt even a shred of safety in that cursed forest. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the trees when I woke to a cold, empty silence. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak, flickering light across our campsite. It took me a moment to realize what was wrong. Mark wasn't there. "Mark!" I called out, my voice hushed, not wanting to wake the others if this was just one of his pranks. But there was no response, only the soft rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze. "Mark!" I called again, louder this time, hoping to hear his familiar laugh or see him emerge from the shadows, teasing us for being so jumpy. But the shadows remained still, and the silence was suffocating. Sarah and Tom stirred in their tents, groggy and confused. Jenny sat up beside me, her eyes wide with worry. "Where's Mark?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's gone," I said, the words heavy in my throat. We all scrambled out of our tents, the cold morning air biting at our skin as we searched the campsite, calling Mark's name over and over. But there was no sign of him, no footprints leading away from the camp, no disturbed earth, nothing to suggest where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply vanished. "This isn't funny, Mark," Tom shouted into the forest, his voice echoing back at us. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the woods. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. Mark was gone, and we had no idea where to start looking. The forest, once a place of adventure, now felt like a maze designed to trap us. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself. "He wouldn't just leave like that." "Maybe he went for a walk," Tom suggested, though his tone was more hopeful than convincing. "He'll be back any minute." But even as he said it, I could see the fear in his eyes, the growing realization that something was very, very wrong. We searched the area around the campsite, venturing further into the trees, but the deeper we went, the more lost we felt. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, each tree looking the same as the last, as if we were walking in circles. As the morning wore on and there was still no sign of Mark, the tension among us reached a breaking point. We started arguing, each of us trying to come up with explanations that made sense, but none of them did. The fear was tangible now, clawing at the edges of our sanity. "Maybe it's the spirit," Jenny whispered, the words barely audible. "Maybe it took him." "Don't be ridiculous," Tom snapped, though his voice wavered. "There's no such thing as spirits." But deep down, we all knew there was something in this forest, something we couldn't explain. The whispers I'd heard before were louder now, almost as if they were calling out our names. Every time I turned my head, I thought I saw something. A shadow moving just out of sight, a figure standing at the edge of my vision. But whenever I tried to focus on it, there was nothing there, only the trees swaying in the breeze. As the day dragged on, the decision became clear. We had to leave. Staying in the forest, waiting for something we couldn't see, something that had already taken one of us, was madness. We packed up our gear in a hurry, the fear driving us to move quickly. But there was a gnawing feeling in my gut that leaving wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. As we prepared to head back the way we came, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wouldn't let us go. It felt alive, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The whispers were no longer just sounds carried by the wind. They were a presence, something malevolent and ancient, stalking us. "We need to stick together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No one goes off on their own." The others nodded, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was gripping my own heart. As we started down the trail, the path that had seemed so clear when we arrived now felt twisted and unfamiliar, as if the forest itself was conspiring against us. I glanced back one last time at the campsite, the place where we had lost Mark, where the forest had taken him. The trees stood silent, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever had taken him was still watching, waiting for its next move. And as we moved deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into its trap. We started at first light, our hearts heavy with fear but fueled by the desperate need to escape. The forest, which had seemed vast but navigable just days ago, now felt like an endless maze designed to keep us trapped. Every direction we took, every path we tried, led us deeper into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no way out. The trees, once tall and majestic, now loomed over us like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out the sunlight. The trail we had followed so easily before was now a twisted labyrinth, the familiar landmarks shifting and changing before our eyes. It was as if the forest itself was alive, bending to some unseen will, determined to keep us lost within its grasp. "We should have reached the road by now," Tom muttered, his voice laced with frustration and fear. But no matter how far we walked, the road never appeared, only more trees, more shadows. "We're going in circles," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. She was right. Despite our best efforts to stay on course, we kept ending up in places we'd already been, the forest mocking our attempts to escape. It was mid-morning when I first saw it, a figure in the distance, standing still among the trees. It was pale, almost translucent, and though it was far away, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and penetrating. The air around us grew icy, the kind of cold that cuts straight to the bone, making it hard to breathe. "There's someone out there," I said, my voice trembling as I pointed into the trees. The others followed my gaze, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone, leaving only the unsettling silence in its wake. The whispers, which had been growing louder throughout the morning, were now deafening, a cacophony of voices surrounding us, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. "Did you see it?" I asked, turning to the others, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't seen it, but they felt it, the same oppressive presence that was suffocating me. As we pushed on, the tension between us grew unbearable. The fear, the frustration, the unrelenting whispers. It all started to tear us apart. Tom and Sarah, who had been the most level-headed of us all, began to argue, their voices rising in anger as they blamed each other for leading us in the wrong direction. Jenny, usually so calm and composed, was now on the verge of tears, her hands shaking as she clutched her backpack, muttering that we would never get out of this place. But it was Sarah who frightened me the most. She had always been the rational one, the voice of reason in our group, but now she was different. She walked a few steps ahead of us, her eyes distant, as if she were in a trance. And then she started talking, not to us, but to something we couldn't see. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soothing as if she were comforting a child. "We'll do what you want. Just let us go." "Sarah, who are you talking to?" I asked, dread creeping up my spine. "The spirit," she replied calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She's been watching us, waiting. She doesn't want us to leave." "Sarah, snap out of it," Tom shouted, grabbing her arm, but she pulled away, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "She says we can't leave," Sarah continued, her voice unervingly calm. "Not until we've paid for what we've done." "What the hell are you talking about?" Tom demanded, but there was no reasoning with her. Whatever had a hold on Sarah was too strong, too deep. She wasn't herself anymore. It wasn't long after that we thought we'd finally found our way out. The trees began to thin, and the light ahead seemed to promise the edge of the forest, the way back to civilization. We quickened our pace, hope surging in our chests as we pushed through the underbrush, desperate to escape this nightmare. But when we broke through the trees, our relief turned to horror. We weren't at the edge of the forest, we were back at our campsite. The same clearing, the same circle of trees, and the same cold, oppressive presence hanging in the air. It was as if the forest had folded in on itself, trapping us in an endless loop. No, this can't be happening," Jenny whimpered, her voice cracking as she looked around in disbelief. "We're trapped," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "We're never getting out of here." The forest had us in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. The whispers were louder than ever now, swirling around us like a storm, their words still unintelligible but filled with a sinister intent. The figure I'd seen before was closer now, almost visible through the trees, its pale form flickering like a candle in the wind. I could feel the despair setting in, the hopelessness of our situation suffocating me. And as we stood there, in that cursed clearing, I knew, deep down in my bones, that we were never meant to leave this place alive. The night descended on us like a shroud, thick and suffocating. We had no choice but to stay one more night, though the thought of what might come filled us with dread. The tension in the air was palpable, each creak of a branch or rustle of leaves sending us into fits of panic. Every noise, every whisper, felt like a prelude to something far worse. We huddled together around the dying campfire, our faces lit by the dim, flickering light. No one spoke. The weight of what had happened, of what was about to happen, hung heavy in the air. We were just waiting for the inevitable, knowing deep down that there was no escape. "Just a few more hours," I whispered, more to myself than to the others. "We just have to make it until dawn." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The forest had us, and it wasn't going to let us go. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, swirling around us in a chaotic dance. The temperature dropped sharply, and a thick mist began to roll in, creeping through the trees and into our camp. Then the attack came. It started with a scream. Jenny's scream, sharp and piercing as something unseen yanked her out of the tent. We scrambled out, but the mist was so thick now that we could barely see a few feet in front of us. We heard her cries, the sound of her being dragged through the underbrush, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing, just silence and the lingering echoes of her terror. "Jenny!" Tom shouted, his voice cracking with fear, but there was no response, only the whispers growing louder, more frenzied. Then Sarah was taken. One moment she was beside us, and the next, she was gone, pulled into the darkness by an unseen force. We heard her too, her frantic pleas, her desperate struggle, but we couldn't reach her. The mist swallowed her up, leaving us with nothing but our fear and the realization that we were next. It was just Tom and me now, and the reality of our situation was sinking in. We were being hunted, picked off one by one, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. "We have to stay together," Tom said, his voice trembling as he gripped my arm. "We can't let it take us." But the forest had other plans. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were words now, voices calling out our names, promising safety, promising escape. I could see the terror in Tom's eyes, the cracks in his resolve. And then, without warning, he was pulled away, his screams echoing through the trees as he vanished into the mist. I was alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat by the dying fire, clutching the knife I'd brought along as if it could protect me. But deep down, I knew it was useless. The spirit was here, closer than ever, its presence suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep would be the end of me. But exhaustion was wearing me down, my eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute. The whispers were relentless, a constant barrage that chipped away at my sanity. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I felt it, cold fingers wrapping around my ankle, pulling me towards the darkness. I thrashed and kicked, my heart racing as I fought with everything I had. I couldn't let it take me. I wouldn't. With a surge of adrenaline, I tore free from its grip and ran. Ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees shifting and twisting, trying to trap me, but I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I broke through the trees, into the open air, the sun rising on the horizon. The whispers faded, replaced by the sounds of the morning. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. The forest had let me go, but the price had been high. I stumbled out of the woods, battered and broken, my mind reeling from what I had just survived. My friends were gone, taken by something I still couldn't fully comprehend. I had escaped, but at what cost? As I made my way back to civilization, the whispers followed me, haunting my every step. I was the only one who had survived the last camp, but I knew I would never truly escape. The forest had left its mark on me, a scar that would never heal. And as I walked away from that cursed place, I knew one thing for certain. Some legends are real, and some spirits will never rest.
The abandoned cabin.
There's something about the forests of Oregon that gets under your skin. It's not just the thick canopy that blots out the sky or the twisted roots that seem to reach for your ankles with every step. No, it's something deeper, something that hums in the air like a low, menacing note, just beyond hearing. I felt it the moment we arrived at the campsite. The others didn't seem to notice, but I've always been more attuned to these things. Maybe that's why I ended up where I am now, writing this down, trying to make sense of it all. Our group of scouts was a mixed bunch, thrown together by the whims of parents who thought a weekend camping trip would be good for us. There was Jason, always the loudest, always needing to be the center of attention. He was the kind of guy who never backed down from a challenge, no matter how stupid it was. Then there was Emily, the quiet one, with a knack for noticing things others didn't. Sam was the joker of the group, never serious, always ready with a sarcastic comment. And then there was me, more of an observer than a participant, content to hang back and let the others take the lead. Mr. Harris, our scout leader, was the kind of guy who had seen it all. He had this way of talking that made you believe he could handle anything the wilderness threw at him. But that first night, I noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of unease that I couldn't quite place. It was there when he looked out into the trees, as if he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. After we set up camp, we gathered around the fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the perfect setting for ghost stories, and Jason, of course, was the first to start. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you guys heard about the abandoned cabin out here?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I hadn't, but I could tell by the way Emily stiffened that she had. Sam rolled his eyes, but even he couldn't hide the slight tension that crept into his posture. They say it's cursed, Jason continued, clearly enjoying the attention. No one's lived there for decades. The last family that stayed there, well, they didn't leave. Not alive, anyway. Yeah, right, Sam scoffed, but there was an edge to his voice. You're just trying to freak us out. Maybe, Jason admitted with a grin, but what if it's true? What if we went out there tomorrow and checked it out? Emily spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. I've heard of it. They say strange things happen around that cabin. People hear voices, see shadows, things move on their own. Sounds like fun, Jason said, undeterred. Come on, don't tell me you're scared. It was a challenge and Jason knew it. None of us wanted to be the one to back down, to be labeled as the coward. So, in a mix of bravado and curiosity, we all agreed. Tomorrow we'd find the cabin. As the fire died down, we prepared to settle in for the night. But something was off. The forest, which had been full of the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, had gone unnervingly silent. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Mr. Harris made his rounds, checking that we were all set for the night. When he got to our tent, he paused, his eyes scanning the dark line of trees just beyond the light of the fire. Stay close to camp, he said, his voice firmer than usual. These woods can be tricky. It's easy to get lost, and there are things out there you don't want to run into. He didn't mention the cabin, but I saw the way his face tightened, the way his gaze lingered on the trees. He knew something he wasn't telling us. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the silence pressed in on me. Sleep came, but it was uneasy, filled with strange, twisted dreams. I dreamed of the cabin, of its dark, rotting walls and the feeling of being watched from the shadows. And through it all, I kept hearing a voice, soft and insistent, whispering my name from just beyond the darkness. When I woke, the sun was barely rising, and the forest was once again filled with the sounds of life. But the unease lingered, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. We were going to find that cabin, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever we found there, it wasn't going to let us go. The next morning, the sun barely managed to break through the thick canopy as we packed up and set off, armed with maps and compasses that suddenly felt more like security blankets than actual tools. The excitement from the night before had worn off, replaced by a tense silence that hung between us like a heavy fog. None of us admitted it out loud, but the eerie stillness of the night and Mr. Harris's warning had left its mark. The hike started out easy enough. We followed a trail that wound through the woods, the path clear and well-trodden. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The air grew thicker, the light dimmer, and the trail began to disappear beneath layers of fallen leaves and creeping vines. It was as if the forest itself was trying to swallow us whole, to erase our presence. Jason, always the leader, took point, holding the map in front of him like it was some sort of sacred text. But even he seemed less sure of himself as the hours dragged on and the landscape became increasingly unfamiliar. Every now and then, he'd pause, turning the map this way and that, muttering to himself before choosing a direction that seemed as arbitrary as the last. No one spoke much. The occasional joke from Sam fell flat, and even Jason's usual bravado had dimmed to a quiet determination. Emily, normally so quiet, kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide and alert, as if she could sense something creeping up behind us. I felt it too, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched by something just out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, we found it, the cabin. It appeared out of the underbrush like a ghostly apparition, half hidden by a tangle of trees and vines. It was even worse than I had imagined. The roof sagged dangerously, the wooden walls were warped and rotting, and the windows were broken, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. It looked less like a cabin and more like the carcass of some long-dead animal, left to decay in the middle of the forest. For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the structure, a collective unease settling over us like a shroud. There was something wrong with that place, something that went beyond the physical decay. It was as if the cabin was alive in its own twisted way, watching us with eyes that we couldn't see. Jason was the first to break the silence. "Well, we found it," he said, but there was no triumph in his voice, only a forced bravado. He turned to us, his face pale. "Let's go inside." Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there while we still could. But no one wanted to be the first to back down, so we followed Jason to the front door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot and mildew. The interior was just as decayed as the exterior. Old furniture lay scattered and broken, dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like morbid decorations. The floorboards creaked ominously under our weight, and every step sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just the decay that set me on edge. There were symbols etched into the walls, strange, twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. They made me dizzy just looking at them, like they were moving, shifting, even though I knew they weren't. Emily was the one who found the journal. It was lying on a table in what must have once been the living room, buried under a thick layer of dust. The cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, revealing cramped handwriting that became more erratic the further she read. "This is disturbing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We gathered around her as she read aloud, the entries describing a descent into madness, the writer rambling about the darkness that surrounds and shadows that move on their own. The final entry stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, the pen scratching off the edge of the page as if the writer had been interrupted. "That's enough," I said, my voice tight. "We need to get out of here." Everyone nodded in agreement. The unease had escalated into full-blown fear, and none of us wanted to stay in that cabin a moment longer. Jason moved to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on, man, don't mess around," Sam said, trying to mask his fear with irritation. "I'm not," Jason shot back, his voice edged with panic. He yanked harder, but the door stayed shut, as if it had been sealed by an invisible force. "It won't open." I rushed to help him, my heart pounding in my chest. We both pulled on the door with all our strength, but it was useless. We were trapped. Panic spread through the group like wildfire. We tried the windows, but they were just as unyielding as the door. The cabin seemed to close in around us, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing colder. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. "We need to stay calm," Emily said, but her voice trembled, betraying her own fear. "There has to be a way out." But as we stood there, surrounded by the decaying remnants of the past, a horrifying realization settled over us. We were not alone. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. We were trapped. The door refused to budge, the windows wouldn't break, and the walls seemed to press in closer with every passing second. Panic was rising like a tide, threatening to drown us all. Jason, always the one with the quick solutions, was yanking at the door handle with such force that I thought it might come off in his hands. But the door remained stubbornly closed, as if it was mocking our efforts. "Try the windows again." Sam's voice was high-pitched, cracking with fear. He grabbed a chair and swung it at the nearest window with all his strength. The glass should have shattered, should have sent shards flying everywhere, but it didn't even crack. The chair bounced off as if it had hit solid steel, clattering to the floor with a hollow thud. Night was falling, and with it came a creeping cold that seeped into my bones, making my breath come out in visible puffs. The cabin, already dim, grew darker by the minute, shadows stretching long and ominous across the floor. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the growing sense of dread that settled over us like a suffocating blanket. "We need to stay calm," Emily said, though her voice trembled, betraying her own mounting terror. She had always been the most level-headed among us, but even she was losing her grip. "There has to be a way out." But the words felt hollow. The walls around us felt less like walls and more like a prison, something alive and intent on keeping us here. And then, just as the last sliver of daylight vanished, the sounds began. At first, it was just a faint creaking, like the old wood settling under its own weight. But soon, it became unmistakable footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the floorboards above us. We all froze, our eyes darting to the ceiling, the realization dawning in each of us at the same time. "We're not alone," Jason whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a wide-eyed terror. The footsteps continued, growing louder, moving from one end of the cabin to the other, as if someone or something was pacing above us. Then came the whispers, soft and unintelligible, slipping through the cracks in the walls, wrapping around us in a cold embrace. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, taunting, as if whatever was out there knew exactly how terrified we were. "What the hell is that?" Sam's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide with fear. No one answered. We were all too focused on the sounds, the creaking footsteps, the whispering voices, and then something else. A dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The sound sent chills down my spine, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run, to get out, but there was nowhere to go. And then the objects started to move. It began with a chair, the same one Sam had used to try and break the window. It slid across the floor by itself, scraping against the wood with a high-pitched squeal that made us all jump. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "This can't be happening," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. But it was happening. The journal that Emily had found earlier suddenly flipped open on its own, the pages rustling as if caught in a gust of wind, though the air was still. We all turned to stare at it, our breaths catching as the pages stopped flipping, revealing a new entry that hadn't been there before. The ink was fresh, the handwriting jagged and desperate, as if written in a hurry. The words sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. "Leave now, or join us forever." "Join us forever?" Emily repeated, her voice hollow. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to get the hell out of here." Jason's voice was frantic, his fear finally breaking through his usual bravado. "We tried everything. We threw our weight against the door, against the walls, but they held firm, as if the cabin itself was conspiring to keep us inside." The sounds around us grew louder, more insistent, footsteps descending the stairs, whispers turning into low, guttural growls, and that terrible dragging sound that was getting closer, closer with every passing second. In a fit of desperation, Jason grabbed a piece of broken furniture and started smashing it against the walls, trying to break through to the outside. But the wood splintered uselessly, leaving the walls unmarked. It was like trying to break through solid stone. Every attempt we made only seemed to provoke the cabin further, the sounds growing louder, more chaotic, as if whatever was in here with us was closing in, tightening the noose. "There's no way out," Sam whispered, his voice trembling with the kind of fear that comes when all hope is lost. But we couldn't give up. I wouldn't give up. There had to be a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. But as the cabin grew darker and the sounds more insistent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time, and that whatever was in here with us was getting closer. The air in the cabin grew thick, suffocating us with a heaviness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the very atmosphere had turned against us, charged with something malevolent and ancient. Every breath I took felt like it was laced with poison, and every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, as if alive with some unseen force. Sam was the first to crack. It started with little things. He'd jump at the slightest sound, his head snapping to the side as if he'd heard something the rest of us couldn't. He began muttering under his breath, his eyes darting to the corners of the room where the shadows were thickest. At first, we thought it was just nerves. After all, we were all on edge, our fear mounting with each passing second. But then it got worse. "I keep seeing things," Sam whispered, his voice strained and barely audible. "In the corners of my eyes, shadows moving, and I hear them. They're calling my name." We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us knew what to say. I wanted to tell him that it was just his imagination, that the fear was playing tricks on him, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it too, Something was in this cabin with us, something that was watching, waiting, and then Sam started to change. At first, it was subtle. He'd flinch at noises none of us could hear, his eyes growing wild and unfocused, like he was looking at something far away. But soon, his behavior became more erratic. He'd stand perfectly still, staring at nothing for minutes on end, his lips moving as if in silent conversation with someone, or something, that the rest of us couldn't see. Sam, snap out of it. Jason tried to shake him out of it, but Sam just stared back at him, his eyes wide and unblinking, his pupils dilated until they were almost black. "They're here," Sam said, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't his own. It was deeper, raspier, and filled with a cold malice that sent chills down my spine. "They've always been here." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, but fear was creeping into my tone. "Who's here?" Sam's gaze shifted to me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were darker, emptier, filled with something cold and inhuman. It was as if whatever was in the cabin had taken root inside him, using him like a puppet. "They're waiting," Sam said in that same unnerving voice. "Waiting for us to join them." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was trying to take us, to consume us like it had done to whoever had written that journal. We were more than just trapped. We were being hunted. "We need to stick together," Emily said, her voice trembling with fear, but she was right. If we were going to survive this, we had to stay together, to fight whatever was trying to tear us apart. But as we huddled in the center of the room, the entity made its move. The air grew colder, the shadows around us deepening, and then all hell broke loose. It started with a violent gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere, whipping through the cabin and sending papers and debris flying through the air. The doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room plunged into chaos. Objects were thrown across the room by invisible hands, chairs toppled over, and the very walls seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous hum. We tried to hold on to each other, but the force was too strong. Something invisible, something powerful, was pushing us apart, separating us like pieces on a game board. I was thrown to the ground, my head hitting the floor with a sharp crack. The world spun around me as I struggled to get up, my vision blurring as the sounds of chaos filled my ears. Then I saw Sam. He was standing in the middle of the room, his body rigid, his eyes locked on something we couldn't see. And then, as if lifted by an unseen force, he was thrown against the wall with a sickening thud. We all cried out, scrambling to reach him, but before we could, he was back on his feet. But it wasn't Sam who got up. His eyes were completely black now, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. His face twisted into a cruel, mocking smile, one that didn't belong to him. When he spoke, it was with that same terrifying voice, deeper, darker, and filled with an otherworldly malice. "You can't escape," he said, stepping toward us, his movements jerky, unnatural. "You're ours now." Panic surged through me as I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't Sam anymore, he was gone, replaced by something evil, something that wanted to destroy us. We were out of time. The cabin seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the walls closing in around us as if eager to swallow us whole. We were running out of time, and we all knew it. Sam, no, the thing that had taken over Sam, was circling us like a predator, its black eyes gleaming with malicious intent. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening until they felt almost solid, pressing against our skin, stealing the breath from our lungs. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her voice trembling with fear but laced with determination. She was clutching the old, tattered journal like it was a lifeline. "The cabin wants us. It won't let us go, unless we give it what it wants." "What are you talking about?" Jason asked, his voice cracking under the weight of terror. He was still holding on to the hope that we could somehow fight our way out of this, but we all knew better by now. "The journal," Emily said, flipping through its pages with frantic fingers. "It talks about a sacrifice. Someone has to stay behind to take the place of the last person who entered." That's the only way the others can escape. Silence fell over the group, the weight of her words sinking in. It was a death sentence, plain and simple. We were just kids, trapped in a nightmare that we never should have stepped into, and now we were being asked to make an impossible choice. Who would stay? Who would sacrifice themselves so the others could live? No, Jason muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. There's got to be another way. We can't just... His words were cut off by the sound of the cabin door slamming open. We all jumped, turning toward the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. Standing in the doorway, his face pale and etched with determination, was Mr. Harris, our scout leader. Mr. Harris, I gasped, a wave of relief washing over me at the sight of him, but it was short-lived. The look in his eyes told me that he knew exactly what was going on, and that he had known for some time. Get back, Mr. Harris barked, his eyes darting to the thing that had once been Sam. The entity seemed to recoil slightly, as if it recognized the threat that Mr. Harris posed. You knew, Emily said, her voice trembling with a mix of accusation and fear. You knew about the curse, didn't you? Mr. Harris nodded, a pained expression crossing his face. I tried to warn you, but I didn't do enough. This place, it's been cursed for generations. The cabin demands a soul to keep its power, and if it doesn't get one, it takes everyone who enters. Then what do we do? I asked, desperation clawing at my insides. The entity was still watching us, its presence pressing in on us like a dark cloud. Mr. Harris glanced at the journal in Emily's hands, then back at us. Someone has to stay behind. Someone has to take the place of the last person who entered. His voice was calm, too calm, like he had already made up his mind. No, you can't, Jason protested, realizing what Mr. Harris was about to do. But Mr. Harris just shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This is my fault. I should have kept you safe. If anyone has to stay, it should be me. Before we could stop him, Mr. Harris stepped forward, positioning himself between us and the entity. He began chanting something under his breath, a language none of us recognized, his voice steady and unwavering. The cabin seemed to shudder in response, the walls vibrating as the air grew thick with tension. Go! Mr. Harris shouted over the rising noise, his voice filled with urgency. Get out of here now! The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing the dark forest beyond. For a moment, we hesitated, torn between the safety of escape and the horror of leaving Mr. Harris behind. But the look in his eyes told us that there was no time to argue, no time to second guess. We ran. The cold night air hit us like a slap to the face as we burst out of the cabin, our feet pounding against the forest floor as we fled. But as I glanced back, expecting to see the cabin shrinking into the distance, I saw nothing. The cabin, Mr. Harris, and the twisted version of Sam. Everything was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the forest. We stumbled back to our original campsite, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. It was as if we had never left. The fire was still smoldering, our tents undisturbed. But the journal in Emily's hands was a grim reminder that it had all been real, too real. We never spoke of it again. We packed up our things in silence, our minds haunted by what we had experienced. None of us could shake the feeling that we had left a part of ourselves behind in that cursed place, a part that we would never get back. As we left the forest, I couldn't resist one last look back. There, in the distance, I could have sworn I saw it. The cabin, standing silently among the trees, waiting patiently for its next victims. And I knew deep down that it would not have to wait long.